originally from Florida, where she did her undergraduate at the University of Florida in wildlife ecology. And she spent several years as a conservation scientist for the nonprofit Marine Conservation Institute in Seattle, Washington, working on a number of marine conservation issues, and then transitioned to a PhD at UC Santa Cruz with Dan Costa, studying satellite tracking as part of the Tagging of Pacific Predators project, TOP. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford at Hopkins Marine Station, and lives in San Diego, where she also works in collaboration with NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center. In January, she'll be starting a faculty position at Old Dominion University as a marine vertebrate ecologist. Today, she'll be talking about the spatial ecology and management of marine predators. So thanks everyone for coming. Here's Sarah.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you guys for inviting me to be here. I actually was saying to Allison, I lived in Santa Cruz for like 7 years, and I've been at Hopkins for several years, and I think this is my second time to Moss Landing, and had I known there would always be all this great food at the seminars, I might have, especially as a grad student, made more of an effort to visit. So as Allison mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the spatial ecology and management of marine predators. So some of the most fascinating and enduring questions in ecology revolve around animal movement. Watching birds migrating naturally brings up questions of where are they going and where have they been. Some of the most fascinating documentaries revolve around animal migration, such as penguins, and caribou. But there are other questions that are central to spatial ecology, including why do animals choose to go where they do? For example, what makes certain areas better for foraging or breeding or mating? Why do animals sometimes change their patterns? How does their physical environment drive where they decide to go? How do human activities influence these patterns? And finally, how can we apply the knowledge that we gain from spatial ecology to help us to better manage marine vertebrates? So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the motivation behind my research and highlight where spatial ecology falls within the broader discipline of ecology. And from there, I'd like to share 2 case studies from my work, specifically the distribution of marine predators, particularly sea turtles and whales off the coast of Central West Africa. And second, the spatial ecology of a suite of marine predators right here off the California coast. And finally, give you some insights into some work that we're just in the process of doing on dynamic ocean management for the protection of marine vertebrates. And if there's one thing that you take away from my talk today, it's that spatial ecology of marine vertebrates can be a really powerful means to increase their, better protect them and manage them, as well as human activities in the ocean, and that satellite tracking in particular can be a really powerful tool for managing marine vertebrates. So the field of spatial ecology focuses on the identification of spatial patterns and their relationship to ecological phenomena, or in the case of marine vertebrate ecology, where animals go in the ocean and what drives them to go there. Spatial ecology is a subfield of the larger field of ecology, but spatial ecology, and particularly as I like to try to apply it to large marine vertebrates, also borrows from a number of other ecological disciplines, particularly behavioral ecology, conservation ecology, biology, ecophysiology, population ecology, and particularly quantitative ecology, or the application of mathematical and statistical tools to help interpret and analyze ecological data. And because space is a central part of animals' life history, spatial ecology really allows for me to integrate these different fields of ecology and gives me the chance to collaborate with a lot of different people, which I personally think is really fun, most of the time. So in the past, much of what we know about animal migration comes from simply sighting animals in different locations. We observe animals in a location, and then we subsequently identify the same animal using unique physical characteristics or markers such as bands or tags. And then we can construct maps that represent their distributions. These kind of mark recapture studies really tell us a lot about animal distributions, but it leaves us with some questions such as what happened between those sightings. And once an animal arrives at a known foraging or breeding ground, how does it use that space? How do these movements change when there are variations in resources, environmental conditions, or human perturbations? And to answer these kind of questions, we really need to be able to follow an individual animal through space and time. So in the past several decades, technology for tracking animal movements and migrations has truly exploded. The same technology that you use in your phone or in your car to get you where you need to go, we can now use to follow animals as small as little bird species literally around the world using satellite tracking. And this video is of sooty shearwaters migrating over the entire Pacific Ocean in the span of a single year. This is one of the longest migrations in the world that was discovered using satellite tracking by Scott Schaefer, who many of you know. Satellite tracking has been particularly important in the marine realm, where animals are really a lot harder to observe than on land. With satellite tracking technologies, we're now able to follow the movements and migrations of everything from jellyfish to blue whales. These incredible advances in technology have led to parallel advances in our ability to understand the patterns and drivers of animal movements. And it's really an exciting time to be a spatial ecologist. So while satellite tracking is this really powerful tool, it presents some unique analytical challenges. When the field first began in the 1990s, just seeing maps of the movements of animals in time and space was such an incredible advancement that it warranted publication in Science or Nature with an N of 3. In the last 2 decades, however, the field has moved really quickly, and spatial ecologists have been looking for ways to understand movement patterns derived from satellite tracking in a more quantitative way. So the research I'm going to tell you about today revolves around specific questions in spatial ecology, including what are the patterns of marine vertebrate distribution? How are these patterns linked to processes that are key to animals' life history, such as foraging and reproduction? How do oceanographic and environmental patterns and processes drive animal distribution, and can we predict their distributions into the future? How do animal and human distributions overlap in space and time? And finally, can we use these spatial and ecological patterns to increase sustainability in marine systems? So now moving on to case studies, let's start a world away in Central West Africa. This is a developing part of the world, probably best known for its political unrest and its rainforest diversity. But Central West Africa actually has abundant marine biodiversity as well. The country of Gabon is located on the equator and has the largest rookery of nesting leatherback sea turtles in the world, on the order of 10 to 20,000 females rock up on their beaches every year to lay their eggs. And it's also home to hawksbills, green, and olive ridley sea turtles, so 4 of the world's 7 sea turtle species. And it's also a key breeding and calving ground for humpback whales and a number of other marine species. Gabon in particular is a really progressive nation. In 2002, the president designated approximately 17% of the land area as national parks, largely consisting of untouched tracts of rainforest. The current president has been making a lot of really great strides in reforming fisheries. And the most recent development is the planned designation of about 20% of the oceans within Gabon's waters as marine protected areas. One of the primary objectives of these marine protected areas is to protect large marine predators from human activities, particularly whales and sea turtles. So spatial ecology is really critical to this process, and our work has been helping to inform where they're going to place these MPA boundaries. So myself and my colleagues, particularly at Wildlife Conservation Society, Gabon, Parcs Nationaux Gabon, and University of Exeter, which is in the UK, we've put considerable effort over the last decade into understanding the distribution of marine predators both in and outside Gabonese waters. Our work has revolved around several questions and hypotheses, particularly what is the distribution of marine predators in Gabonese waters? What are the environmental influences that drive these distributions? And how do these distributions overlap with human activities? In this work, I had the ability to run a lot of the field work, particularly for sea turtles, which was really fun. I'm still doing quite a bit of work there. As well as the analytical and the quantitative components of the project, using a number of models, including Bayesian switching state space models, distribution models, and habitat modeling. So in the early 2000s, we knew pretty much nothing about the spatial ecology of almost all marine vertebrates in the Southeast Atlantic. Almost nothing was known, for example, of the nesting ecology of olive ridley turtles prior to our tagging program. The best knowledge was synthesized in this Convention on Migratory Species report in 2001, and only major nesting sites were known, which were oddly shown by flowers. There was pretty much no knowledge at all on the migratory or the foraging grounds of this species. Since then, we've made really incredible advances. We had hypothesized that the olive ridleys would migrate north to these presumed foraging grounds off of Nigeria. However, every single one of the almost 40 turtles we've tagged have migrated 1,000 kilometers south to Angola. And working with a student at University of Exeter, we applied ensemble habitat models to understand what are the important habitats features for these turtles. We now understand the influence of temperature fronts on their distributions, and these fronts really serve to congregate their prey. Some of the most fantastic migrations we've observed came from leatherback turtles. After nesting, leatherbacks migrate, some of them migrate westward across the entire Atlantic, in some cases as far as Brazil. But humpback whales, I think, really give the leatherbacks a run for their money. In a paper that we had in conservation biology this year, we confirmed that humpbacks from Central Africa travel all the way south to Antarctica. Genetic evidence had sort of suggested this pathway, but we showed the full migratory paths of these animals using satellite tracking. Using state space models, we showed that humpbacks switch to this foraging mode once they reach the ice edge near Beauvais Island. And one of the most surprising results was that some of the animals actually migrated further north into the Gulf of Guinea, including 2 females with calves. This really disrupted the current hypotheses for some of the animal distributions in the North Atlantic, and the International Whaling Commission is using this information to try and restructure some of the stocks that they've designated. So myself and my colleagues have put a lot of effort into understanding the migratory movements of a number of these species, but more recently we've been shifting our efforts back to the waters within Gabon to understand more fine-scale movements. So for example, since we began our tagging program in Gabon, we've been able to understand some of these basic spatial and ecological questions about internesting movements and nesting ecology of olive ridley sea turtles. We've also applied habitat modeling techniques to understand what drives internesting habitat, and we found that, yes, there are certain environmental conditions that they prefer, particularly related to sea surface temperatures. However, this shift to Gabonese waters has really been at the request of the Gabonese government as they conduct this marine protected area process that I mentioned. We've been particularly focused on understanding multi-species distributions and overlap with human activities such as fishing, as well as oil and gas development, which is so prominent in this part of the world. We've discovered some really interesting ecological patterns. So for example, by looking at multi-species migration patterns, we discovered there are some commonalities in migration corridors, particularly for olive ridleys, turtles, and humpback whales as they move south. Yes, there we go. And leatherbacks departing from one of the major nesting beaches in the south also utilize this same region as they move west. And as the result, this entire region is potentially going to be proposed as a marine protected area. Looking at the fine-scale patterns of olive ridley and leatherback internesting movements, we found that in the northern part of the country, there is a distinct core for both species when we combine tracking data from them together. So this map shows their movement from Pongara National Park, and one of the largest nesting beaches in the country. And the core areas are the more colored boxes, and then the entire distribution is in the gray that you can see in the background. So this area has been proposed as a permanent MPA nearshore. And a seasonal closure is being considered during the nesting season to help encompass all of their additional movement that we saw in gray. I've also used quite a bit of Bayesian state space modeling extensively for our work in Gabon. State space models can be used to combine animal movement, behavior, and the sometimes considerable error that's associated with satellite tracking locations, and to do this all in one single integrated stochastic model. I am not going to go into the equations behind state space models, but one of the most powerful components of it is that we can determine the most probable track of an animal and the error that's associated with each of those locations. This becomes particularly important when we're looking at fine-scale movements, such as those that are related to really small features. So, for example, I used a state space model to determine sort of the fine-scale foraging for elephant seals in the North Pacific. The blue and the red dots are the state space model tracks, and you can see the white lines behind that representing the raw satellite tracking locations. So, using state space models, we were able to really determine this fine-scale probable foraging that was occurring over seamounts in the North Pacific, which are shown, and the foraging is shown in red. And then using dive data, we were able to verify that animals were actually diving all the way to the surface of the seamounts, probably foraging in the deep sea coral communities that are found there. So determining this most probable track and understanding the error associated with the tracks is really important when we're considering animal movements in relation to MPA boundaries, which can sometimes be fairly small scale and very, very specific and defined, such as we were trying to do in Gabon. So for example, sea turtles, and particularly olive ridleys, are especially at risk from bycatch in coastal waters. There is one MPA, Mayumba National Park, that already exists in the southern part of the country. Though this MPA was actually designated with no knowledge of the spatial ecology of this species, and bycatch seemed to be continuing despite the fact that this MPA had been put into place. So we wanted to examine the fine-scale patterns of use, but we've particularly using home range estimation, which is a pretty common sort of method to use. But we found a lot of the usual methods like kernel density really over-smoothed and over-interpolated the data, making it really difficult to find fine-scale patterns, particularly in relation to MPA boundaries. So a colleague of mine, Barry Nickel, who's at the UC Santa Cruz GIS lab, who's a wonderful person, teaches a wonderful class up there if anybody has an opportunity to take that. We developed this, what we call the gridded utilization distribution method for R and ArcGIS that allows for a more intuitive approximation of animal movements, particularly against really fine-scale boundaries, like coastlines, temperature fronts, or MPAs. So using this method, we were able to discern the core habitat for olive ridley sea turtles, which is shown as the more of the orange and the red squares in there. But we also wanted to be sure that this really was capturing the animal movement. So we used the credible limits, or the error associated with the state space models, to examine the error structure that we saw around each of these locations for the satellite tagging locations. And we found a core portion of the internesting habitat may actually be outside the realm of the park. So that's the squares that are shown in the light green. And this is one of the more powerful aspects of state space modeling for satellite tracking. You can understand not just where the animals are likely to be, but where else they might be, which is really critical for these kind of fine-scale movements and fine-scale determination that you need for things like marine protected areas. So another critical consideration when we're designating these MPAs has been the needs of the local people. Gabon's primary income comes from natural resources, and local people depend on fishing as a primary means of livelihood and as well as sustenance. So as a result, we really wanted to examine where are the key areas of overlap of fishing and animals. So using vessel monitoring system data, we applied similar distribution models to the fishing activity as we did to the animals. And we found, not surprisingly, there are areas where animals overlapped really heavily with the fishing industry. These areas are shown as the colored squares in there. with the more red areas indicating higher overlap between fishing and animals. So this is where the animals are spending a lot of time, and so are the fishermen. So the probability of bycatch is really high. But we also wanted to know where are the animals not overlapping with fishing. These are the key areas to not put into protected areas, because these are areas that the local people need in order to make a living. So these are the gray scale areas with the dots on the inside. These are areas you'll find will be really unlikely to be included in the MPAs once the final designations are made, because these are really important for local people. So this MPA process, well, it was moving really quickly in the fall. It's kind of stalled. That's how things go in Gabon. But it's still moving forward, and it's been a really interesting process to be a part of. My role has really been to provide and sometimes interpret the science that we've done, and then the managers are using that information to decide where the boundaries are going to be. For several months, I would wake up in the morning to emails of hey, can you do this, this, and this? And oh, and by the way, could you do it yesterday? So it was a little bit of a stressful time, but it's been really exciting to be a part of it. We expect, the boundaries of the MPAs were supposed to be announced in summer. I've heard it's been pushed to the National Parks Congress, which is going on in November in Sydney. But in the last few months, I got a look at the first draft placement of the MPAs, and it's been kind of cool because you can see the work that we've been conducting on spatial ecology of these species has really informed this map. So for example, this large MPA in the southern part of the country is likely to protect these migration corridors that we talked about, and the permanent and seasonal closure off of Pongara to protect turtle nesting. These boundaries are likely to change, but it's still been the work that we're doing actually being used and coming to fruition. So now we really understand a lot more about the spatial ecology of a number of marine predator species in Gabon, but our work is ongoing. This fall, we're going to try to deploy transmitters on male sea turtles, which is challenging because they don't come to beaches. And we're also planning on conducting a pilot project to understand what are the behavioral and the physiological impacts of human activities, so we can begin to understand a little bit more about thresholds and stress in animals. So we've made a lot of strides in understanding predator distribution in Africa, but what about here in the US? Not surprisingly, we know a lot more about marine predator ecology in the US than we do in Africa, and we're much more advanced in our management and our knowledge of marine predators. But I'm particularly interested in how well spatial management measures, such as marine protected areas, are protecting marine predators. And we know a lot about the spatial ecology of many marine predator species, particularly here along the California current, probably more than anywhere else in the world, in large part because of the Tagging of Pacific Predators project, which I was a part of as a grad student and I continue to be involved in. So TOP, as many of you know, is a multi-institution project using satellite tracking to track over 20 species of marine predators in the California current. But in addition to just knowing where they're going, we're also interested in using this incredible knowledge of species to understand how we can manage marine predators more effectively, particularly in regards to human impacts. So we all know there's this huge diversity of human impacts in the ocean, but these impacts don't necessarily have simple individual effects on predators or other parts of the marine ecosystem. Multiple impacts are likely to act simultaneously on marine predators, creating what are known as cumulative impacts. And these cumulative impacts are particularly important in a spatial context. For example, animal movements are obviously spatial. Human activities are spatial, as well as management measures. They usually are spatial completely or incorporate some spatial component. For example, marine protected areas, marine spatial planning, time area measures, oil and gas leases, just to name a few. We also here in the California current have some of the largest marine protected areas in the world. There are 5 national marine sanctuaries, as you all know, distributed along the U.S. West Coast that total over 30,000 kilometers. But despite this, no one's ever really considered what is the cumulative impacts on from human activities on marine predators, and if the national marine sanctuaries are having a role in protecting top predators, which leads me to my role in the TOP program. So my primary research questions revolved around some similar ones. Again, what's the distribution of top predators in the California current? This time focused on a suite of marine species. To what extent are predators found in the national marine sanctuaries? How and where are these predators influenced by cumulative human impacts? And finally, what's the role of the national marine sanctuaries in protecting marine predators, if there is any at all? So to do this work, we used a suite of modeling techniques. Again, state space models, distribution models, and this time we added a cumulative impact model. And I also had the chance to do a lot of field work, which was really fun, working with elephant seals up at Año Nuevo and also California sea lions in the Channel Islands, and then collaborated with a number of folks that were collecting data on a number of other species. So how do we begin to understand the complexity of cumulative impacts, and to do so in a quantitative spatial framework? So the best thing to do with anything complicated, in my opinion, is to break it down into multiple components. So there's several things that we need to know. First, we need to know what are the individual impacts and how are they distributed in space. For species, ideally we want to understand not just if species are present or absent from an area, but how relatively important is a habitat to a species. We need to know the relative sensitivity of different species to each impact. And then finally, to combine these spatial and non-spatial components into a single spatially explicit model. So to do this, we use the TOP data set and human impact data in the California current from Ben Halpern's group at UC Santa Barbara. We use 685 individuals from 8 species, or the tracks from those individuals, 3 pelagic bird species, 4 marine mammal species, and leatherback turtles, which is really the only species that's found consistently along the study area. And that data came from Scott Benson, who many of you know from his affiliation here at Moss Landing. We process tracks using state space models, and then use that gridded utilization distribution that I described earlier to determine the relative habitat use and importance for each species. I also use this weighting scheme to account for different tag lengths and reduce tagging location bias, yada yada. And so in the end, we ended up with a map that looks like this, where the darker colors are more utilized habitat and the lighter colors are less utilized. In this map, habitat for all 8 species has been combined. And you can see that the animals were much more concentrated on the continental shelf, which is not terribly surprising, since these are the areas where upwelling productivity is more concentrated and where animals are more likely to find food. We then use, such as right offshore, where there were tons of humpback whales just a moment ago. We then use the spatial footprint of 24 human use drivers from the UC Santa Barbara data set, including drivers related to climate, fishing, pollution, coastlines, and shipping, which resulted in maps that look like this, with the darker colors representing area of higher impact intensity. And you can see that the human impacts and activities are concentrated closer to the coastlines, which, again, not terribly surprising because that's where we live. So not all of these human impacts, though, will have the same impact on individual species. For example, consider the probability and the impact of a ship strike on, say, a whale versus a sea turtle. So I determined the relative impact of each human activity on each of the 8 species. This consisted of an extensive and incredibly painful literature review of over 300 documents across the 6 vulnerability measures for each of the 24 impacts, giving a single impact score to each layer, resulting in 192 scores. It's really painful. So now we have all of our different components, relative habitat use of each species, spatial distribution of impacts, and relative impact on each species. And now we want to be able to put these 3 things together. So we developed an algorithm for what we call the cumulative utilization and impact model, which I'll call cumulative impacts for short, which was based on the cumulative impact model developed by Ben Halpern and his colleagues. And so we found, not surprisingly, that cumulative impacts were greater near the coastlines, due both to the concentration of human activities and the species near the coasts. Still, this pattern wasn't true for all species, and this is a really important point. So, for example, if you look at this first panel, you see that seabirds had extensive offshore distributions. But in the second panel, you can see that cumulative impacts were greater on the continental shelf, more so than off the continental shelf. So what this means is that we can't decouple the spatial distribution of species and the distribution of impacts. If we aim to protect just where the species are found, we might miss the areas where they actually need protection from human impacts. Finally, the highest cumulative impacts were found in the California sanctuaries, and this was across all species. So that was somewhat surprising, but it has some considerable management applications. Regulations in the sanctuaries on the U.S. West Coast and in other parts of the U.S. vary quite a bit, but for the most part, protective measures are somewhat limited. They weren't, and additionally, the sanctuaries weren't designed specifically to protect predators. The primary objective of the sanctuaries, particularly in California, was to protect against oil and gas development. A lot of them were developed in the wake of the Santa Barbara oil spill, and for that purpose, they've done a phenomenal job. So despite some of these limitations, I would say that this is still, the sanctuaries are in a really unique and important position. The footprint of the sanctuaries already exists. Increasing the protective capacity of some place that already exists is likely to be an easier political battle than starting from scratch. NOAA is using the results of this work in a number of applications. First, there's a proposed expansion of the Cordell Bank in the Gulf of the Farallones sanctuaries north to Point Arena. And in 2011, this figure actually made it to the floor of the US Senate, which was kind of cool, as part of a bill to expand the sanctuaries. It's kind of undergone a different process since then, but NOAA's completed, I think they've completed the public comment period to boundaries and are now in the process of the impact assessment. And then finally, NOAA's using this as part of their California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, which is one of the primary ways that NOAA's based management in the US. And since top predators are really an important part of the California current ecosystem, they're trying to integrate a lot of these data layers into the IEA process. And it's kind of cool, they actually plan to use the methodology for some other functional groups like foraging fish, which is kind of exciting. So now I'm in the process of working up analyses, looking at some of the seasonal variation and how predators are using the sanctuary and the whole California current, which is really important to understanding where and when human activities can be conducted safely. But the real next step for this work actually segues really nicely into the next segment of my talk, on work that we're working on right now on dynamic ocean management in the California current. And this is really still a work in progress, so I'm just going to give a fairly brief overview, but if anyone wants to talk about it later, I'm very happy to talk about it at great and obnoxious length. So the work we've been doing in Gabon and in the California current has really advanced our understanding of the spatial ecology of marine species. However, we've really been considering species movements, human activities, and the ocean itself as a stationary thing. But it's clear when you watch a video like this that the ocean is really a fluid and dynamic system. The methods to managing marine vertebrates, such as marine protected areas, have been really stationary as well. Stationary management is likely to be less effective, though, particularly when it comes to highly mobile or even semi-mobile species, and particularly when dealing with really mobile human users like fishermen. How could we draw a box around ocean features or animals, such as these lace sand albatrosses, moving over scales like this? Now imagine trying to draw a box around even a portion of elephant seal distributions up there at the top in green. it would be such a large portion of the ocean that this would probably be fairly politically unfeasible. Of course, we can protect parts of their range using marine protected areas, but more flexible management approaches could really help incorporate more of their movements as they flow through what is really a dynamic ocean. Applying a dynamic view to spatial management of the oceans is what we're referring to as dynamic ocean management. And it's the center concept of a project that I'm working on with a number of folks at Stanford, San Diego State, University of Maryland, UC Santa Cruz, and also NOAA, in partnership with the National Marine Fisheries Service and with fishermen themselves. We began the project with funding from Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions to build the conceptual framework behind dynamic management, and now we're working on a case study that's been funded by the NASA ROSES program, applying this concept to the California drift gillnet fishery just off of our coast. So through our working group, we define dynamic management to mean management that changes in space and time in response to the shifting nature of the ocean and its users, based on the integration of new biological, oceanographic, social, and/or economic data in near real time, so on the order of days to weeks to a month. And while we're giving a name and a definition to dynamic management, in many regards, this is not a new concept. Fishermen do it all the time. If bycatch in a certain area of a protected or a nuisance species is too large, they move on. The broader concept was probably initially suggested by David Heirenbach, Karen Forney, and Paul Dayton in a paper in Aquatic Conservation in 2000. And there are also a lot of examples that already exist in management. So for example, in New England, shipping vessels are warned of the presence of whale calls that are detected by buoys. Vessels either slow down or avoid the area in order to avoid injuring the whales. Another one that's fairly well known is Turtle Watch, which is an experimental voluntary program that NOAA developed out of Hawaii, designed to help the longline fleet there avoid sea turtle bycatch, which has previously actually shut down the fishery several times. So scientists at NOAA determined the temperature preferences of sea turtles using satellite tracking data, and they use these preferences to regularly highlight areas fishermen should avoid, and they post those online. I believe it's approximately every 6 days. So other examples exist of dynamic management for fishery, and this is one area where dynamic management has been applied really readily, and why we chose fisheries to take this concept to the next step. So we're applying dynamic management to a case study on the drift gillnet fishery on the US West Coast, which largely targets swordfish, mostly in California waters. Gillnets are known for bycatch, and despite the California drift gillnet fishery being perhaps one of the cleanest gillnet fisheries in the world, bycatch is still a huge issue in this fishery. So the goal of our work is to understand if we can simultaneously reduce bycatch of key species while maintaining economically viable swordfish catches using this dynamic management approach. So we're focusing, at least for this initial period, on 3 bycatch species that are key in this fishery. First, California sea lions. So as you know, California sea lion populations are fairly healthy, and bycatch levels in this fishery are still below levels that would cause population level impact. So they're well below PBR. However, California sea lions predate marketable catch in the nets, and they're really a nuisance species for the fishermen, in addition to not being a species that we want to be having really high bycatch numbers of. Similarly, blue sharks are one of the highest bycatch species in the fishery, with annual bycatch numbers in the thousands. Blue sharks are not marketable. Finning is illegal, as you know, and their meat is not edible at all. Apparently, it's very, very oily in a bad way. They also pose a significant safety issue for fishermen. They get caught in the nets, and they're really difficult and dangerous to remove. And they really increase the time and the costs associated with removing them from the nets and repairing the damage that they cause. Finally, leatherback sea turtle bycatch has really dominated management of the drift gillnet fishery for a number of years. There's a large seasonal closure called Leatherback Conservation Area that was put into place to reduce bycatch of leatherback turtles. Encounters with leatherbacks are incredibly rare. There have been 21 observed interactions since the start of the fishery in 1982. However, as you know, this is a critically endangered species in the Pacific Ocean. So since the leatherback conservation area has been put into place, interactions have dropped to almost zero. But this has come at a huge economic cost to the fishermen. A large portion of the swordfish fishing grounds occur within the boundaries of what is now the leatherback conservation area, and during the exact months of the year that are the most profitable for them for fishing. So when the leatherback conservation area was put into place in 2000, this was really cutting-edge management. It was considered a refined closure in space and time, and it was based on the best available data. Since then, though, we've made some really great scientific strides. Scott Benson and his colleagues have collected satellite tracking data on leatherbacks, documenting that they move all the way from Indonesia to forage for jellyfish along our coast here. NOAA has defined critical habitat for leatherbacks in the US so that we better understand the relative importance of different habitats within the leatherback conservation area. Quite a bit of work has also been done, again, by Scott and his colleagues to understand the relative importance of different oceanographic features to the foraging and thereby the movement of these species. So all of this means that we now understand that this is a large static closure put into place to protect what is really a highly mobile species with really varied and mobile habitat. This led us to realize that a more dynamic approach to management based on the more refined knowledge of the spatial ecology of this species really just makes sense. Within this large closure, turtles are not uniformly everywhere. If we can use tracking and other data like fishery observer data to understand the features that turtles and other bycatch species are using, we can predict into the future where they're likely to be and turn this large static box into a closure that moves and shifts in time just like the species do. This would give the fishermen back some of their fishing grounds and simultaneously help to balance these ecological and economic objectives. So to do this, we're using empirical habitat modeling techniques, which integrate animal observations through tracking and fishery observer data with environmental covariates such as bathymetry, sea surface temperature, upwelling indices, to create mathematical models that help us understand why animals go where they go, and then to predict their movements into the future. So we'll be creating these models across 4 species to predict into the future where bycatch is likely to occur and areas that fishermen can avoid or where management measures can be placed. And then combine these models across all species and automate this process to be updated through what we're referring to as the EcoCast model on short time spans such as days or weeks. So while science is really critical to this project, much more important are the partnerships that we're using to take this science forward to actually be used on the water. This project has been really a collaborative effort between NGOs, scientists, academic institutions, government, and also the fishermen themselves. Our scientific team spans 4 academic institutions who are contributing tracking data, expertise, and analytical time. And we're working in partnership with 8 scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center who are, again, contributing fishery data, satellite tracking data, and expertise. And they're also helping us to pave the way forward to collaboration with the drift gillnet fishermen. We're working directly with the Pacific Fishery Management Council and NOAA's West Coast Regional Office, which is responsible for implementing the management measures that are set forth by the council. And a large portion of the work associated with this project has gone into developing these relationships and then making sure that the work we're doing will actually be applicable to the management issues that they're dealing with right now. Drift gillnet fishermen are also critical partners in this project. They are in support of the project, in large part because it might reduce the spatial and temporal regulations of on their fishery, as well as help them reduce some of the bycatch nuisance species that they don't want to be catching anyway. They're also partners in helping us collect data for the project and helping us to validate the models that we're trying to put together. One of the most recent developments in the project is that we've started working directly with the Nature Conservancy to try and expand eCatch, which is this fishing and smartphone and tablet application that they developed for the groundfish fishery off the US West Coast. We're going to be building on this app by adapting it to the drift gillnet fishery so that fishermen can collect data to validate models in near real time, collect sightings on data poor species, such as sperm whales, and then finally to use the eCatch mapping interface so that we can actually serve the data from the models back to the fishermen and to the managers as well. And our goal is really to make this an interactive tool so that different layers and habitat thresholds can be applied so the tool can be used both by managers as part of designing regulations and also for fishermen to use voluntarily to reduce bycatch. Our future research is aimed at applying this work to other fisheries, as well as considering it in terms of using it for other industries such as renewable energy or military operations. I think there's a lot of applications for dynamic management. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge all of the many funders and take any questions. Go ahead.
All the protected areas and what has been the enforcement capabilities in that area?
You know, the public perception, I'm actually not sure. I was supposed to have been there last year and I was ill and I couldn't go, so I haven't gotten a really good feel of what it is. Generally speaking, like both the government and the people of Gabon are fairly progressive. It's kind of this weird little spot in the middle of Central Africa. And I'll be there in October, actually, so I'll get a better sense of things on the ground. As far as enforcement, that's an excellent question. And, you know, I kind of simplify things for the purpose of the talk and not go into too much detail. But, for example, in Mayumba National Park, I think that, you know, for as much as maybe the boundaries aren't quite where they're supposed to be, I think the larger issue is actually enforcement. And it's fairly complex in terms of a lot of the illegal fishing isn't actually occurring on Gabonese fishermen. It's occurring from foreign fishermen who fish in these little pongas, and they sneak into the park in the middle of the night, they set their nets, and then they go back into Congo and they just camp on the beach. And so they're part of what they're doing as part of this project. So there's another project that I'm actually not a part of, but that my colleagues at Exeter have been working on for a number of years through the Darwin Initiative, is helping to train the local government officials in terms of using things like GIS, helping them to use VMS data, and really helping to increase the capacity for them to do things like enforcement. And in addition to doing this MPA planning, the president has also really put a lot of effort into reforming fisheries and increasing their capacity and their ability to monitor and enforce not just MPAs, but fisheries in general. The U.S. Navy has actually been pretty involved in that as well. So it's been worse and it's getting better. That's kind of the answer.
Regarding the drift net closures, did the sword fishermen use alternative gear types to continue fishing, or were they banned from fishing during those periods?
So there's about 12 answers to that. They have done, so over the 30 years that the fishery has been in place, they've actually done a phenomenal job of reducing bycatch of a lot of species. So they haven't actually changed gear types, but they've done a lot of modifications, including a lot of technological modifications, like they've used pingers They set the nets, I think it's 30 or 60 feet below the water to try and reduce catch of, a lot of the air-breathing animals. I know that there's like a whole suite of, they've had all kinds of different spatial closures to reduce. So they haven't actually changed gear types, but what they're in the process of doing now, they being NOAA and a few other nonprofit organizations, is looking at some alternative gear types. So buoy gear is one that they're looking at. That one's really promising, and then it's really low bycatch, and the quality of the swordfish that they catch is really high, but it's kind of more of an artisanal fishery sort of thing, because the quantity that they catch really isn't high enough. There is some harpooning that happens, but it's not reliable, and it's really expensive because it requires, either, just hunting around for swordfish that happen to be on the surface enough that you could harpoon them, or using helicopters to find them and then, targeting those areas. They're also looking at potentially doing a deep set long line, which the jury's still out on whether or not that's better or worse, and also whether or not it's economically viable. The last few years have been really just poor swordfish years in general. And so they did a bunch of gear testing in the last 2 years. But it was kind of inconclusive because basically nobody was catching any swordfish using anything. And so they didn't catch anything either, so it's kind of like, I don't know yet, so they're going to keep doing that. So they are looking at gear switching, which I think is really promising, and one of the things that, we're excited about. Like, the drift down fishery is not the cleanest fishery in the world. Like, it's not a great thing. But at the end of the day, Americans eat swordfish, and having locally caught swordfish is still, there's debate about, people will debate this idea that some folks put out there that if we were to shut down the Gillnet fishery in California, that it wouldn't actually reduce the demand for swordfish in the U.S. And so instead, that niche would be filled by foreign markets that have way worse, environmental regulations. And then in some cases, you're catching literally the turtles from the same population, just on the other side of the ocean. So, or whatever species, blue sharks, whatever. So they're really working towards trying to find a solution that kind of hits, because it has to be economically viable, and that's one of the harder parts of the issue. And the fishermen will tell you that the swordfish don't they don't school in the same way in the California current they do in other places. I don't personally quite understand exactly what they mean, so I just don't know. But they say that basically drift nets are the most efficient and one of the few economically viable ways to do it, except potentially for long lines. So jury's still out, but they're working on it. They're actually working quite hard on it right now.
Is there any talk about having shifting or seasonal MPAs that follow maybe a migration?
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of one of the other. So that's kind of like the other side of the coin from dynamic management. So we're kind of approaching it more from the industry specific. So shipping or fishing or something like that. But the other side of that coin would be dynamic or mobile in protected areas. And I think that's quite a feasible thing. I think there's not any that I know of that exist. I've been kind of feeling that out in terms of, I think it's a really interesting question. I think that it's very feasible. I mean, just for the same reasons that we can do this kind of thing with fisheries, we can totally do that with an MPA. I mean, we have the capacity to know exactly where we are at any given point in time, and to be able to know exactly where boundaries are when they shift over the course of a day or a week. We can totally do that. I think there's some interesting questions that still exist that aren't necessarily unique to dynamic MPAs, but particularly when you're talking about a really mobile species, having some sense of how that might impact at a population level is still really unclear. I mean, that's true for stationary MPAs as well when you talk about really mobile species. I think there's one paper out there that says that an MPA increased had a population level impact on a dolphin species, but even that species was fairly coastal. It wasn't mobile when you're talking about leatherbacks, which is just mind-blowing in terms of but yes, that idea is